by the time everybody joins. It would be very good if you could, during the presentation, if you could mute yourselves so there's no background noise, because even a little background noise from 100 people can be quite disturbing. Just during the presentation, otherwise it's not a problem. We'll have two questions and answers sessions, one in the middle, a short one, and then a final one. The reason you see me in profile sometimes is I have two screens and I look at the other one sometimes. So somebody's eating. Bon appetit. All right, I'm going to share my screen and start. Let me see, which one is it? This one, I think. Okay, everybody's able to see the screen, yeah?
Yeah, got you.
Okay. If you could, all of you, please just mute yourselves, so you know we kind of have a bit of quiet.
Thank you.
So if you didn't hear me say it before, welcome everybody to the webinar. My name is Noru Tsalic. This is the topic, as you see here. And let's start let's make something clear. If there is anyone who still believes that this is somehow connected to Jeremy or related to Jeremy Corbyn, let me start by disabusing you, okay? If this works. Okay. So these are you're going to hear two individuals, non-Jews, who come from the left, from the Labour Party, and this is what they have to say.
This is one I'm particularly proud of. Nicola ran off an stencil machine in about 1985. When I was a lot younger, and it was a meeting at Liverpool Trade Union.
Can't hear them.
לא שומעים.
Could you make it a bit louder, Noru?
Not here. No here.
I'm afraid I can't. It was the recording wasn't very good, but now it will be better. Listen.
Cartoons that portrayed Menachem Begin as in the uniform of Heinrich Himmler and stood on a pile of Palestinian skulls. That's in the early 80s. So the imagery of Nazi comparisons and that being a phenomenon of anti-Semitic anti-Zionism is something that was around then. It was indeed around even further back than then because of the Soviet Union.
So you heard these two gentlemen. This is something that's been around for 30 years and even before. And in fact, it's older than that, because even in the 19th century, they were already talking about anti-Semitism being present among people who consider themselves socialists. And in fact, you know, we find anti-Semitism, at least in my opinion, it's clear anti-Semitism. I know there are people who have different opinions, but in my opinion, it's clear anti-Semitism in some of the works of Karl Marx. And it has deeper roots than that. I trace this kind of ideas to the Enlightenment in Europe. The intellectuals of the Enlightenment, they actually, on one hand, wanted to emancipate the Jews. They wanted to integrate them, to give them rights. But on the other hand, they only saw them as able to be integrated if they reformed themselves, if they were reconstructed, because the Jews, as they were, as they saw them, they didn't think they are acceptable in polite company, okay? And also, in their view, during the Enlightenment, Jews might be acceptable if they kind of renounced their separate identity, if they became just citizens, individuals, and not a collectivity, a community, or certainly not a nation. Okay, and where does Corbyn come in all this?
It came in organisationally through Ed Miliband changing the party constitution so you could have a vote in leadership elections for £3, and through one of the routes was the Palestine Solidarity Campaign had a database of 100,000 people that had emailed their MPs during the 2014 Gaza war, and they wrote to them and said, Jeremy Corbyn's our patron, you can change Labour's position on Palestine by paying £3 and voting for him to be leader.
So this is what we call entryism, and it's also not a new phenomenon. I mean, it was advocated by Trotsky, it was implemented in France in the 1930s, and it was implemented in this country by the militant tendency, which tried to dominate, to take over the Labour Party before they were expelled by Neil Kinnock in the 1980s. So this is all not very new. Now, I'm going to talk about anti-Semitism and attitudes to Jews and Israel on the left. So I know some of you will be kind of suspicious. Is this guy a right-winger who's trying to smear the Labour Party and so on and so forth? Am I a left-winger or am I a right-winger? It's a legitimate question. And the truth is, I am neither. And I'm not centrist either. And I sure as hell am not a fence sitter, believe me. Let me explain. This is not, me trying to be diplomatic here. I genuinely believe that there are decent and legitimate and good arguments on both sides. If we take something that's not connected with anti-Semitism, like labor relations, if I ask an employer, he's going to say one thing, and if I ask a trade unionist, he's probably going to give me a different position. And I genuinely believe that there is merit in both these arguments. And I think there must be a sweet spot somewhere where, both interests, both points of view are taken into consideration, are taken on board, and are balanced in a reasonable way. And the same, I think, can be said about any conundrum, any dilemma, any issue in modern life. And I think, there must be some sort of golden path to progress where on one hand, we don't impede progress, we don't impede economic growth, we don't impede entrepreneurship, running businesses, but on the other hand, we don't ride roughshod on our fellow people, we don't, exploit them, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem is that it's very difficult to find this golden path because we all have our own ideas and so on. And what in practice, I think, tends to happen is we put one government or one party in power, and they might take us too far to the left. And then we change the government, because you can't do that in a democracy, and that government might overcorrect. And so instead of walking straight on this golden path to progress, we kind of meander our way around it. And that's all right. That's all right. As long as we don't stray too far from it, we're kind of going in the right direction. But we can only do that if we are ready to change our opinion, change our views from time to time. Because sometimes I hear people saying things like, oh, I'm a Labour person, I'll never vote when that Tory scum, or the equivalent from the Tory side. And I'm thinking, if everybody thinks like that, then we wouldn't have democracy. We will keep one party in power forever. I'm exactly the opposite. In my life, I voted with left wing, I voted with right wing. You know, I'm what you call the swing vote. You heard about the swing votes, I'm the swing vote. I reserve the right to think each time afresh, and I don't think which is the best ideology. That doesn't interest me. What I think is, what do we need here and now? And that's how I vote. And you know what? I think that democracy works because of people like me. And I think that ideology is the enemy of democracy, especially extreme ideologies. Extreme ideologies hate democracy. They can't stand democracy. Now, I'm talking about political views. Usually we view this political spectrum, right? We have the far right here, we have the far left, and the far left is furthest away from the far right, right? Wrong. I don't think that it's like that at all. I think the political spectrum looks like a horseshoe. And you get the far right and the far left actually not that different, not that far apart. You get extremists and you get moderates with various political views. That's why I believe you get someone like Nick Griffin praising Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, Nick Griffin, who's probably somewhere here in terms of political views, he doesn't look at Jeremy Corbyn and sees a political opponent. He sees kind of a kindred spirit. Now, if I'm talking about political extremism and extreme ideologies, how do we know that an ideology is an extreme ideology? Well, I think what characterizes an extreme ideology is this tendency to divide the world into two camps, two categories. And it's not, I mean, we all do it sometimes, but the extreme ideologies, for them, these categories are absolute, okay? If you're one of the good guys, you're always good, and if you're one of the bad guys, you're always bad. It's immutable, it's rigid. And that's, I think, the mark of extremism. And something else that I wanted to say here. Sometimes I see Jews joining these extreme ideologies, and my heart bleeds, because I know from history that Jews and extremism don't mix well. It doesn't end well for the Jews. This guy, Leon Trotsky, ended up being murdered at the behest of the orders of Stalin. This guy here, also a Jewish guy, Ettore Ovazza, was one of the founders of Italian fascism, one of the early supporters of Mussolini. He and his family ended up being murdered at the hands of the Nazis. So it doesn't, Jews, and it's, you know, if we take nothing else from this webinar, I really would like everybody to remember that Jews and political extremism don't cohabit well. But let's come back to this black and white kind of view of the world.
The left has been guided for many decades by a very simplistic, very crude ideology, a set of ideas or a worldview that kind of erases complexity, has no space for contradiction, no space for a gray area. It's some, I call it campism, that the whole world is divided into two camps.
Now, just to make something clear, I mean, Professor Johnson is himself a left-wing man. He comes from the Labour Party, he always held left-wing views. So when he talks about the left here, he means the left of the left. In other words, the far left or the hard left. It's not that, you know, you can certainly be a leftist and be a perfectly moderate person. Now, one of the ways that the hard left divides the world is between the oppressed and the oppressors. There's nothing wrong in itself in that, because there are oppressed people and there are oppressors. But for the hard left, this is absolute. You know, if you're oppressed, you're always oppressed in every situation. And if you're part of the oppressor category, then you're always bad. For instance, this guy, John Rees, who's one of the leaders of this movement, this is what he said: socialists should unconditionally stand with the oppressed against the oppressor, even if the oppressed country is undemocratic and persecutes minorities like Saddam Hussein. In other words, socialists should support Saddam Hussein because Iraq is oppressed. Saddam Hussein, somebody who killed hundreds of thousands of people, he used mustard gas against his own civilian population to get rid of minorities, to punish those minorities and stuff like this. The colleagues of this John Rees, you know, would talk in the same way about somebody like Mao or Maduro in Venezuela and so on. So you get this kind of, you know, absolute support for that category, that absolute category of the oppressed. But something else that I wanted to show here. This expression, oppressed country, this is something a bit new, because traditionally the hard left didn't care about the countries. I mean, remember, proletarians of all countries unite. It was the class that was important, not the country. The country wasn't important. But here we see a shift in that position. They're talking about oppressed countries, and conversely, there are oppressor countries. So now we have not just a social division into classes, but a geopolitical division of the world, and it's just as absolute. And we see the same kind of thinking in the latest Labour Party manifesto. You can see here countries in the global south, to which we owe kind of historic injustices. And when they say we must recognize, we must address historic injustices, they don't mean the Labour Party, and they don't even mean the UK, they mean us, the West, or us, the white people, something like that. Now that caused me to think, how do we know, according to this framework, how do we know if a country is oppressed, if a country is part of the global south or it isn't part of the global south? For instance, in the Middle East, okay, if I were to ask someone like John Rees, he would tell me that Iran and Iraq certainly are part of the global south. Israel certainly isn't part of the global south. Saudi Arabia, I think he would be reluctant to include it in the global south because of the alliance with the United States and so on. So when they say global south, they don't mean geography. I mean, Saudi Arabia is to the south of Iraq. Australia is further to the south, but it's not part of the global south, okay? So what do they mean? They don't mean, do they have progressive politics? Because these countries, you know, Iran, Iraq, Syria, they don't have progressive politics or progressive regimes. There is the issue of historic injustices, but let's think about it. I mean, Iraq and Syria were ruled at some point by British and French colonialists, but historically, they were ruled by these European colonialists for a very short time, something like 25, 30 years. That's all. That's, in historical terms, it's nothing. They were ruled by the Ottoman Empire for centuries. So why is it that the West owes them, you know, reparation for historic injustices and not Turkey? It's not clear to me. But if I were to ask someone like like John Rees, you know, you've got to choose between Israel and Saudi Arabia. You've got to include one in this global south. He would choose Saudi Arabia over Israel, for sure. And why? The question is why? And the only answer one can find is that this has to do with the issue of race. And you find a lot of evidence for that. You know, this portrayal of Israel as kind of the representative of the white people in conflict with other races. And it's not even an issue of actual race. Those of you who live in Israel or visited Israel, you know very well that Israelis come in, you know, in every color. And you can't tell, if you dress them the same, you can't tell an Israeli from an Arab just by the way they look. They look the same. But the perception, that's a question of perceived race, not actual race. So this conflict is, this conflict is kind of transformed, perceived as a kind of race war. And I'll give you some more evidence.
Okay, but you cannot take it out of context. You cannot live a life of a privileged white person, settler colonizer in a country, take away their rights, deny them their water, their land, and their freedom, and their life, and expect to sit around with... Okay, but you cannot take it out of context.
So my question here is, you know, what's that got to do? Why are Israeli Jews suddenly white privileged persons? What's skin color got to do with this? And to me, what they're espousing here is a racist ideology, because when I start to make judgments based on the skin color, when skin color becomes a factor of assessment, whether someone is entitled of support or not entitled of support, you know, who's the bad guy, who's the right guy, the good guy, who's the worthy community and the less worthy community. Once you bring skin color into that, it becomes a racist judgment, a racist ideology. Because what's skin color got to do with it? Skin color is just as helpful in assessing if somebody is a good person or a bad person as the hair color or the color of the eyes. What's that got to do with anything? Now, these people, their view, and we heard it many times from Jeremy Corbyn, they believe that you find racists at one side of the spectrum and anti-racists on the other side. But I don't think it's like that at all. I think at the extremes, you find bigots, you find people who are intolerant of others and intolerant of ideas and intolerant of opinions. And then you find people who are open-minded but have various political convictions. And that is why people who are clearly racist, who actually would call themselves racist with pride, okay? People like that look at Jeremy Corbyn and they don't see a political opponent. They see someone whose thought processes are similar to their own. Where does this leave Jews? Well, it leaves us in a very unpleasant, very uncomfortable position. There is already a background, a baseline of prejudice against Jews in Europe. Because in Europe, for many centuries, Jews have been the only significant other, the only other race, so-called. What these extreme ideologies are doing, they build on that prejudice. They take it further so that Jews become sort of a different race that for some were not white enough, and for others were not black enough. And because it's always easier to build on existing prejudice rather than inventing a new one. And that's precisely what they're doing. And that is why you see things like this. You know, you see people who think of themselves as left, as Labour. Corbyn was right. Okay, free Palestine. And what does she tweet? She tweets anti-Semitic stuff, often taken from far-right websites. And this is clearly anti-Semitic stuff that can be traced to far-right websites. And it's mixed freely with what she would call anti-Israel or anti-Zionist stuff. You can see here this child kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by Israelis, and a lot of blood here. And the only problem is that this child was actually Iraqi, and he was killed by other Iraqis. And even usually this is not admitted, but even when she admits this, this tweet is simply ignored. This one is liked, it's retweeted, this is ignored, because if Jews are not involved, if the child was not killed by Jews, then, you know, it's not important. I'll give you one more example. I could give you thousands. This guy calls himself, guy or girl, calls himself or herself the Goyim No. The Goyim No is kind of has become kind of a slogan of the far right. But he or she called himself a socialist, an atheist, anti-war, and so on. And the stuff he's tweeting is, anti-Israel stuff, anti-Semitic stuff, again, from far-right websites, and stuff that he would consider to be anti-racist, all mixed together. Okay? Now, why don't we take just a couple, 2-3 questions, if there are any, Judy? Judy?
Yeah. Hi, I've unmuted myself.
I have a question.
Go for it.
Gerald.
No, the junction between the oppressor and racism, I think, might be considered in terms of colonial power against the oppressed. And when we look at colonial power being expressed, say, in Africa, it resulted in slavery with the enslavement of the blacks. And so you have a combination of an imperialist power taking control over the indigenous population. So you have the oppressor against black oppressed. So I see that connection, but I still don't see the extreme left as the function, unless you say the extreme left is really anti-colonial or anti-imperialist. Over.
Right. So if you talk about Africa, I totally agree with you. That can be the connotation. But when the same kind of view is then transferred to the Middle East, where color is not an identificator, and where slavery was not an issue, unless we consider, slavery, unless we consider the fact that Arabs have been slave traders in their history, but that's a different issue. I don't see why these people bring the issue of race. I don't see why they bring the issue of colonialism to a Middle East where race was not an issue, skin color was not an issue, and slavery was not an issue. So that translation of the situation in Africa to other places, and that kind of language colored by or informed by a sort of race war, to me, that's clearly racist. That portrayal of the Arab-Israeli conflict as a conflict between the white race and the sort of people of color is a false portrayal. It's a completely false portrayal, and it's a portrayal that is informed by racist thinking, in my view.
Okay, so one question that we've had really is a more general one, and that is whether we should just assume that the left wing are a lost cause to be opposed and fought, not attempted to be converted. That's from Alan Blumenthal.
First of all, I want to be very careful here not to generalize and not to kind of expand. As I said, I think I said it or I implied it, left-wing ideas of justice, of social justice, of more equality, and so are perfectly legitimate. And, you know, I certainly wouldn't throw the baby with the dirty water. My rant here is against the hard left, is against the extremists, not against the moderate left, the sane left, if you wish to call it like this. Okay, I've got absolutely nothing, and in fact, I identify myself with some of those ideas. I support some of those ideas, as long as they are moderate and not extreme. So, you know, I don't want, and you'll see further in my presentation that I'm trying to run away from this discussion of, you know, left wing is good and right wing is bad, or the opposite, because in my opinion, that kind of discussion is exactly the type of extreme discourse, discourse of the extremists. You know, when you, it's okay to militate for more social justice, for more equality, and so on and so forth. The moment you start talking about the other side as the Tory scum and so on, you've called yourself an extremist, basically. We can't hear you, Judy.
There's a bit of chat in the chat room about can you have a Jewish racist and where slaves were sent from.
Absolutely. You can have a, you also can have a Jewish anti-Semite. You know, people are very complex beings. You know, if you read historically, if you read, I mean, certainly the abolitionist movement in the United States was a progressive movement. But if you read what they wrote, including Lincoln, a lot of what they wrote at the time, what they said at the time, was clearly racist. Some of them had a very bad view of Black people. Well, they were still abolitionists, okay? So as human beings, and we'll see further in the presentation, as human beings, we can hold in our minds opposing ideas. You know, we're complex beings. It's not that simple. So yes.
So people are agreeing with you. They say, yes, Gilad Atzmon and Karl Marx. And just say, anybody wants to ask a question during the second part, do write your question on the chat and we'll make sure it gets covered.
Okay, I'm going to go on. So, you know, I'm talking about left wing and right wing. I've got a question actually. Where do you put the SNP in this framework? The Scottish nationalists. I mean, in terms of economics, they're kind of left wing. In fact, on some issues, they're to the left of the Labour Party. But on other things, you know, defend national interests, on other things, they belong to the right. So I'm asking, is this framework, right wing, left wing, still the best framework to judge political opinions? There's another framework, which is universalism versus particularism. And let me give you an example. I'm going to use two American presidents in the same place, not at the same time. This is at the UN General Assembly, okay?
sitting in a prison cell, a young Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that human progress never rolls on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God.
It is a profound honor to stand here in my home city as a representative of the American people to address the people of the world.
So what's the difference? I mean, other than the hairstyle, okay? I think that Barack Obama kind of talks on behalf of the entire humanity, the efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And Trump said, I'm the representative of the American people speaking to the rest of the world. So I don't want to generalize, but in this instance, Barack Obama spoke as a universalist and Trump spoke as a particularist. And sometimes I read definitions of these things and they say something like universalist emphasizes what unites us and particularist emphasizes what divides us. If I define things like that, then clearly one of them is good and one is bad. Because, you know, uniting is a positive word and dividing a negative word. Now, let me tell you a few anecdotes, and they're true stories. They happened to me. So the first one, quite a few years ago, if I'm honest, I was a student here in the UK studying for my MBA at Warwick University. We were a very interesting international group of people, and we had all kinds of discussions. At the time. The issue that preoccupied us was, will the UK adopt the euro as its currency? There was such a discussion, if you remember. And interestingly enough, I remember one of my British colleagues, and the vast majority of our British colleagues agreed with him. And he said, you know, if these Europeans want us to adopt the euro, that's fine, provided they give us the control over the currency. They let us call it the British pound and have the Queen on it. Okay, this is story number one. Remember this. Story number two, once upon a time, I was offered a job in a place called Limburg. It belongs to Netherlands, but it's like a finger wedged in between Belgium and Germany. I didn't know the place, so I wanted to visit to see if I'd like to live there or not. But how do you know a place? Just by visiting. You know, it's very difficult. So what I did is probably what you would have done. I went into a pub, got myself a beer, and started to talk with the locals. Everybody speaks good English in Netherlands, so it was easy. We had a bit of small talk. At some point, I asked, look, if I come to live here, will I have to teach myself to learn Dutch? Because I don't speak any Dutch. And this young guy told me, nah, forget it. It's not a problem. Everybody speaks English. You'll be all right. But the bartender, who was a bit older, more experienced, he told me, yeah, you'll be all right. But if you want to integrate socially, you know, at home with friends, we don't speak English. Ah, I said, I want to integrate socially. So you're telling me I should learn Dutch? He said, that's not what I said. You see, over here, we are Dutch citizens, but we're not Dutch. We're something else. You know, we have our own language. We call it Limburgish, and the Dutch people don't understand it. It's something else. Ah, I said, so you tell me that, you know, I need to learn Limburgish. Is it difficult to learn? He said, it depends. It depends where you want to live. Because over here on this side of the river, we speak one kind of Limburgish. And I think it's easy. But on the other side of the river, they speak a different kind of Limburgish. I don't understand it. And I think theirs is very difficult. Now, I'm coming back to when I was a student in the UK. My parents came from Israel to visit me. I took a few days off and I took them on a tour of Wales. Why Wales? Because they've been in England before. I thought it would be interesting. And we happened to this small medieval city, town rather. I think it was Carnarvon, but don't catch me on this. It was many years ago, I don't remember. But I know my guidebook said you should visit this church because it's very old, from the 11th century. So we went to visit the church, and the priest was there. He came to welcome us. And as soon as he realized we are foreigners, the very first thing that he wanted to tell us was, I'm not English, folks. Make no mistake, I'm speaking English to you, but we're not English here. We're Welsh. We're a different people with different traditions, with a different history, with a different language. It seemed very important to him to tell me this, somebody he didn't know from Adam, to tell me this. I don't want to bore you with too many stories, but as I traveled through the world, I understood that it's like that everywhere. Certainly in Europe, but not just in Europe. I mean, in Italy, I spoke with somebody about Italy before. In Italy, you know, they're all Italians, they all speak Italian, but in every place, in every region, they have their own language, their own dialect. Sometimes these dialects are completely different. They're not Italian, they're something else. And it's very important for them to keep this different identity, this different language, these different traditions. Let me show you something else.
How you guys doing? How are you? Good. First like this, my name's Dustin. Good. What are you cooking? So I'm doing a traditional English style sausage roll with an Italian twist on it. Well, hold on a minute. Sausage roll? Yeah, sausage roll. Yeah. Well, I figure English Italian. Try to, you know, kill two birds with one stone. I'm Scottish.
He's Scottish, not English.
I love sausage rolls. Look how excited this guy is. I love them. What's your twist? Well, instead of using the banger sausage, I used spicy Italian sausage. And then I also made a little creamy marinara to go on the plate, kind of spicy and sweet. In England, it comes in a paper bag, a sausage roll. Look at you. What have you wrapped it in? It's actually just puff pastry. I hope you guys like it. Listen to that noise. Would this be like a main course or a hot dog? If it's hot dog, put it inside. Sausage roll. Hot dog, no. Look at that thing. What's that now? Parmesan cheese. Oh, what's that now? What's the second? A little parsley. Trust me. Look at it. Anyway, I'm not going. What's that? A little basil pesto, just for show. Just for show. You put pesto on a sausage roll? Not on it. Around it. I've got to go first. You got to do it, please. The sauce. What's in there? Just marinara cream, a little bit of garlic, pepper. Oh, Chef, how about some for the rest of us?
Well, there was nothing for the rest of them because he ate it all by himself. He loved it so much. And why wouldn't you love it? I mean, look at this. Look at this. It's beautiful. It looks great. I bet it tastes brilliantly. Look at all these ingredients. I'm cooking a little bit in my spare time. I'm not a great chef, but if you talk to a great chef, he will tell you that in a good dish, you have to taste every single ingredient. You know, everything you put, if you put it in, you've got to taste it. It's got to have its own identity. They all need to work together harmoniously in the dish. But you've got to be, each one of them has to add something, its own flavor, its own aroma, its own texture, okay? And keep its individuality. I mean, look at this dish. Imagine I take it and I put it in a liquidizer. I turn it into some sort of slush. Would you like to eat that? I don't think so. And that's, folks, that's why I love Europe. I absolutely adore it. Despite the history, despite the anti-Semitism, I really love it. You know, you travel, you drive a few miles here, a few miles there, you hear a different tongue, you see different people, you taste different flavors, it's different wine or beer, or variety is the, you know, the spice of life, isn't it? But not everybody thinks like that. Not everybody thinks like that. A few years, as I grow older, I tend to say a few years ago more and more and more. Anyway, a few years ago, I went to see a presentation by a young Israeli guy. He came from a left-wing Israeli outfit, and he gave a presentation, and I noticed that every time he talked about Israel and said the Jewish state, he really didn't like it. He almost spat the words out. And so at the end of the presentation, I went to him and I asked him, why does it bother you so much? I mean, it's a, okay, Jewish state, there's a French state, there's a Finnish state, there's a Hungarian state, there's also a Jewish state. What's wrong with that? And he looked at me really, you know, he really didn't like the question and didn't like me. He looked at me down his nose, and when he spoke to me, he didn't speak to me, he preached to me. And he said something like, you see, dear fellow, for us progressive people, this whole thing about nation states is absolutely wrong. It's passé, it's 19th century. You know, we progressive people want to see a world without borders, without states, without identities, a world where people are just people and nothing else. And I was reminded of this guy when I came across a short propaganda video that was put out by the European Commission recently, 2-3 years ago. And I think it's very interesting. Let's listen to it, and I'll try to provide a bit of running commentary.
For centuries, this used to be the European way. In the 20th century, twice we Europeans tried to commit collective suicide.
So he talks about the 2 world wars, clearly.
And this is the result. If fear takes over in society, if hatred of the other becomes the norm, this is where we end up. Neighbors lying together in a cemetery who fought each other and killed each other in 2 world wars.
Now, I'm not so sure that the First World War was the result of fear and hatred. I don't think the Germans hated the French so much, or the French hated the Germans so much then in the First World War, or indeed that they feared each other so much. I'm not so sure, and I'm also not so sure that the Germans in the Second World War feared the Jews so much. But okay, let's go on.
Europe has learned this lesson. This is a mistake we need to avoid. Every time when we are challenged, this is a risk we run. How do we respond to that? Extreme nationalism? No. I strongly believe that the answer to the challenges of today, which are manifold, such as terrorism based on jihadism, is not to fall for the temptation of fear, is not to fall for the temptation of hatred for the other.
Okay, so I think we all agree that extreme nationalism is something very bad, but I'm not sure, I mean, the First World War was not a war of nations, it was a war of empires. That's the very opposite of nations. And even the Second World War, it wasn't so much about nationalism, it was about a racist ideology, an ideology that thought in terms of biology, of, you know, almost species that are different. And also, I don't quite see where terrorists based on jihadism fits in this discussion of World War I and World War II. I really, you know, don't think it quite fits there.
Nationalism is like alcoholism, a short period of exaltation, followed by a long period of headaches.
So now he's talking from a Holocaust museum. And again, I mean, I'm not so sure, as I said, I don't think fear and the Holocaust, I'm sure the Jews feared the Nazis, but the Nazis feared, was the cause of the Holocaust, the cause of the war, fear? I'm not so sure. And something else, he kind of smoothly moved from extreme nationalism to any nationalism. Any old nationalism is a bad thing. It's an addiction, he says, like alcoholism.
Nationalism makes us poor because its Siamese twin, protectionism, will destroy the internal market and disrupt international trade.
Is protectionism the Siamese twin of nationalism? Well, sometimes it is, but does it have to be? I mean, the Scottish nationalists, are they protectionists? I don't think so. They wanted to stay in Europe. They're in favor of free trade. They're not protectionists.
Nationalism makes us weak because it's eternal seeking of enemies, its disdain of others, its need to feel superior.
So now he's talking about supremacism. But again, is nationalism always associated with supremacism? The Scots that want their independence, do they do that because they're seeking enemies, because they have disdain for the English? Do the Catalan nationalists have disdain for the Spaniards? They feel superior to the Spaniards? I'm not sure. This presentation seems to me to be wildly exaggerated. It's almost like he wants to make a point and he forces it, he stretches. You know, he listed here a whole list of negative things and he's trying to say that one derives from the other, but he's kind of stretches the logic out of shape, it seems to me. And what's the point he wants to make? He makes it at the end. He says, basically, you know, if you're a nationalist, you can't call yourself a patriot. You cannot call yourself a patriot if you consider yourself German or French or anything like that. You can only call yourself a patriot if you call yourself a European. Okay, interesting. But you know, he put this video out, he tweeted it, as you do these days, but it didn't, it was kind of ignored. Nobody took it, you know, too seriously. But one European embassy retweeted it, promoted that tweet, the embassy to Israel. And they didn't just promote it, they added a message to Israelis, a message that they took from that video, which says, nationalism makes us weak, poor, and morally insecure. Europe has learned this lesson. And what they want to say is, we have learned this lesson. Have you guys? Now, I'm Jewish, I'm Israeli. You know, I resent this. I don't like this. Don't give me lessons about the Holocaust. It's my grandmother's family that was exterminated in the Holocaust. Don't make it into an educational thing for me to bash me on the head with it. You know, it's not your place to make the Holocaust into a lesson for the Jews. But besides all that, besides, more important than all that, I think it shows why people who come from a particular ideological background don't quite like Jews. Because if your ideology is about a world without borders, without states, without identities, then Jews who notoriously are keen to, you know, they've always been a minority and they're keen to keep their separate identity, you know, it kind of goes against the grain. And even more so the Jewish state. You know, if even the Jews, these people who have been dispersed and didn't have a state of their own for so long, if even they want a nation state now, a nation state of their own, it goes against our entire ideology. It goes against what we believe. So of course we don't like this stuff. And to me, this is a throwback to the Enlightenment position, where, you know, Jews are welcome as long as they kind of shed that separate identity. we don't mind them as individuals, as citizens, but we do mind them as a collective, as a nation. And, you know, for some of these people, for some of these ideologues, Israel has become a symbol of nationalism today. And that's a lot of the reason why they don't like it. It's a symbol of nationalism. But is nationalism, moderate nationalism, I mean, obviously extreme nationalism, extreme anything is bad, is very bad. But is moderate nationalism, is being proud of your heritage and so on and so forth, and wanting to keep that heritage, is that such a bad thing? You know, are these people like the priest in Wales and all these people, are they fascists? Are they racist, supremacist, protectionist, all these things? I don't think they are. If I define universalism and particularism like that, then clearly one is good and one is bad, but I don't think these are good definitions. To me, universalism emphasizes what makes us similar. We're all similar as human beings. And particularism emphasizes what makes us unique, special, each and every one of us. And they can be good or bad, depends on how we use them, where we use them, to what extent we use them. I don't think we need to choose one or the other. I think our minds are complex enough, sophisticated enough. We can juggle these apparently opposing concepts. We can use them in a reasonable, balanced way. One thing is clear, we should keep away from extremes. I mean, extreme particularism is indeed supremacism. This attitude that, you know, we're better than others, that some people don't belong, and so on. But extreme universalism, I call it uniformism, and I think is just as bad. It's the tendency to try and take away people's identity, you know, force them into set molds. For instance, by dressing them all the same, as it was done in Maoist China. You know, kind of trying to take away the identity and turn them from individuals into some sort of gray masses. I mean, these people are smiling here, but do you think they're happy? Does this make them more equal? I don't think so. And, you know, supremacism and uniformism are not necessarily opposites. They can come together, because if I divide the world absolutely into us and them, then I might not want much difference within the us and within the them. So they can come together. To me, supremacism and uniformism are both dehumanizing ideologies. Supremacism tries to take away that what makes us similar, and uniformism tries to take away that which makes us unique, special. And we need both these things as human beings. That's what makes us human beings. You see, I'm looking at the other screen and I see your pictures there. And just by seeing you, you know, I see that you're all human beings. I can see that. And the fact that each of you looks differently, is a bit different, doesn't bother me. You know, it doesn't take away from the fact that I identify you as human beings. In fact, it helps me identify you as human beings. If you looked all the same on that screen, I might have doubts that you're human beings. Maybe I'd think you're robots or mannequins or something, because normal people, real human beings, don't look all the same. So I don't think we need to choose to be universalists or particularists. I think, you know, we can balance these concepts. We can balance these attitudes in the proper way. Now, I've given a previous seminar, and somebody on the chat said this: universalism is a basic tenet of Judaism, tikkun olam, repairing the world, okay? And indeed, we are commanded to mend the world, to perfect the world under God's kingdom. Yeah, that's universalism, and that's part of Aleinu, a prayer that we say with every single service. It's very important. But people that focus only on this want us to forget that Aleinu has another paragraph. It has two paragraphs, not one. And the first paragraph tells us something else. God didn't make us the same as other nations, not better or worse, just different. It didn't settle us the same. It gave us a unique task and a unique destiny. That's particularism, folks. So Judaism in Aleinu, and believe me, throughout the sources, you'll find that Judaism tries to balance universalism and particularism. They're balanced. So I don't think that universalism in its own is a basic tenet of Judaism. Yes, we are commanded to do tikkun olam, but unless we develop our own people, our own culture, our own heritage, then we have very little to contribute to the world. So we need to do tikkun am as well. And we can only do these things if we also develop ourselves as individuals. Tikkun Adam. And by the way, Tikkun Adam is part of the slogan of Hashomer HaTzair, the left-wing youth movement. This is not some sort of right-wing mumbo-jumbo. So the basic tenet of Judaism, I think, is balance. And not just as Judaism, it's, it's the art of living. The art of living is keeping, opposing views and opposing trends and opposing forces in balance, in fine balance. The human progress runs on two engines, cooperation and competition. We cannot achieve anything worthwhile by ourselves. We've got to cooperate with others. But we work best when we also are in competition with others. That's why we love sporting events. What's a football match if it's not an exercise in cooperation and competition? Even football players know how to do that. It's only extreme ideologies that try to take away one of these engines. Communist tries to do away with competition and turn people into this gray masses without individuality. Extreme capitalism tries to do the opposite, takes away the cooperation, and it's all about competition. It's all about, killing each other, individuality taken to extremes. Neither, I think, works very well. Another way to look at it is solidarity versus identity. As I said, the fact that you guys look different, that you have different identities, doesn't mean that I feel less solidarity with you as human beings. These are not, it's not a zero-sum game. One doesn't necessarily come on account of the other. These people that I talked about, they're not bad people. They're not national, they're not extreme nationalists, they're not fascists, they're not protectionists and all the other words. They want to keep their specific identity. That's all they want. And identity is very important to human beings. It's what makes us human beings. Progressive people shouldn't try to mess with people's identities. That's not what the progressive people should do. That's what extreme ideologies do. They try to engineer identities and take away identities and manipulate identities. It's only extreme ideologies that think that if we have different identities, then it takes away from our solidarity. That's not true. But this kind of uniformist, this kind of thinking is part and parcel of these extreme ideologies. It's part of them. It's those ideologies are based on this. And so we come round and round to the question we started with, which is, will Starmer stamp this out? And, you know, Starmer, in the very short period of time, and let's face it, it was very short, he's done some great things. I mean, the disciplinary processes in labor certainly work better and faster. It just shows that if you want to do it better and faster, you can do it better and faster, okay? He's gotten rid of some anti-Semites. He's even dismissed a shadow cabinet minister for retweeting an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and so on. So, and there was a backlash, but he seems to be coping with the backlash, right? So we have reason to be optimistic. But you see, my problem is that I think the disciplinary approach, and don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking it. We have to discipline people who step out of, you know, the bounds of acceptable discourse. But I don't think this approach will solve the problem, because by definition, the disciplinary approach is designed to deal with individuals. You know, the assumption is there are a few individuals out there that do unpleasant things, and I'm going to discipline them. But that's not the problem. Remember, this is part and parcel of those extreme ideologies. And so if I only deal with it with the disciplinary processes, then I may drive the problem out of sight because people will become afraid of speaking. But the prejudice will stay there because the prejudice is bound together in this ideology. Just as a comparison, imagine that there was entries into the Tory party by the English Defence League, okay? And then the Tory party, you know, it would throw the doors open to the English Defence League, and then they'll institute disciplinary processes to take care of those who do or say something racist. But the very ideology of the English Defence League is racist. So I don't think this works. I think that the only way to drive out prejudice is by excluding the ideology that harbors and nurtures that ideology. And the real question should be not if Keir Starmer is better than Jeremy Corbyn, of course he is. But the real question for me is, will Keir Starmer do what Neil Kinnock did at the time, which is to get rid of the militant tendency altogether? Will he do that? I don't know. In fact, very little is known about the politics of Keir Starmer. He's a big political unknown. I don't know, maybe some of you know more than I do about him, but I did research him a lot. I mean, he's always been left-wing, a Labour person, but exactly what faction of Labour isn't known, okay? In 2003, he wrote an article calling the Iraq war illegal, but he's not known to be on the barricades about it, okay? Then he was director of public prosecutions. Obviously, he couldn't make political statements. And then there was Corbyn, and he clearly wasn't a fan of Corbyn, but he was also not a big oppositioner, you know, to Corbyn. In terms of anti-Semitism, he said all the right things about it, but again, you know, he didn't climb the barricades. I mean, compare him with Tom Watson, for instance. You know, Tom Watson was much more vocal, much more active about it. And as for Israel, he is a registered supporter of Labour Friends of Palestine. He is not a registered supporter of Labour Friends of Israel. But on the other hand, he's not known as a hothead in terms of Palestine and so on. When he was asked, are you a Zionist? Do you consider yourself a Zionist? He said, no, I'm not a Zionist, but I'm in favor of a secure Israel, whatever that means. So these are the facts, okay? Now, my opinion, and feel free to have your own opinions about it. My opinion is he wants to be prime minister. It may sound obvious to some of you, but I don't think it was so obvious about Corbyn and others. And I think he has a strategy of dealing with politics. And I would call that strategy the Teflon strategy, okay? Because he doesn't want anything to stick on him. Okay, you can't stick a label on him. He doesn't do things that allow people to stick labels on him. And that's why I don't think he'll make blunders like Corbyn did, but he's also unlikely to take moral political stances, especially when they might be costly for him in terms of politics. One thing is clear, that he will want to put this whole anti-Semitism scandal behind him as quickly as possible, especially since, we all expect a rather damning report from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission pretty soon. And he will want to say, well, that deals with the past, we've moved on, we've done things, we've repaired things, and so on. Okay, he'll want to move quickly away from it. He certainly will want a good relationship with the Jews in the Labour Party. And the truth is, it's not so difficult today, because the Jewish labor movement, which is the main, has moved to the left a lot. And they're also keen to have a good relationship with him. About Israel, I think he's indifferent at best. And because he's indifferent, he's unlikely to take a supportive attitude in the way, based on feelings or emotions like Tony Blair did. His attitude is much more likely to be driven by political interest. And I don't think it's in his political interest today to side with Israel. Hence, his appointment of Lisa Nandy as Foreign Secretary. Lisa Nandy, let's remember, she's chair of the Labour Friends of Palestine. She talked about the rights of Palestinian refugees. She signed up to the right of return of Palestinian refugees to their homes in Israel, not in Palestine. Very quickly, my conclusion. I don't think personally that one can kick anti-Semitism out of the far left. But I think, because I think it's part of that ideology, as I keep saying. But one can kick the far left out of the Labour Party. And the question is, will Starmer do something like that? And to me, that boils down to where he wants to position himself on this spectrum. See, I think Corbyn is about here. I think Tony Blair was about here. Where will Starmer be? My guess, and it's only a guess, feel free to make your own guesses. My guess is he will be somewhere here. Okay, more moderate than Corbyn for sure, but far away from Tony Blair. If nothing else, because the Tories position themselves very close to where Tony Blair was once. And so, in my opinion, he's unlikely to do a Neil Kinnock and kick the far left out of the party. And as a result, my conviction, my opinion is that under Starmer, we'll see less obvious anti-Semitism, less overt anti-Semitism, perhaps but by and large, the Labour Party, I believe, will remain an unfriendly party to Jews and a very, very hostile party to Israel. And just to finish with this, sometimes, you know, it's incredible, these things. This is Claire Short, of course, and Claire Short accused Israel of global warming, no less, you know. Because of Israel, the international community cannot agree on a reaction to global warming, and this might end the human race. So now Israel is to blame for the potential ending of the human race, okay? Incredible. And some, expressions are perhaps more moderate, but they kind of say the same thing. Annexation is a danger to not just Palestinians and Israelis, but to us all. And now annexing parts of the West Bank is a threat to the entire humanity, okay? Not just a threat to Israel, not just a threat to Palestinians, it's a threat to the entire humanity somehow. And I'm going to leave you with this, he is a left-wing Trotskyite, actually, theorist, Sean McGammer, and he said the most malignant hysteria on the left concerned Israel and the Palestinians. Okay, all sorts of other things are expressed in intense hostility to Israel. So that's all. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have questions, now is the time.
Okay, Noru, I've got a few comments or questions that have come through on the chat. The first one is from Sarah, saying about anti-Semitic Jews. Would that be your explanation for Israelis like Gidon Levy, Asaf Harel, and others with similar views? Anti-Israel activists often use these people as extra ammunition against Israel. On the other hand, my impression is that Amos Oz is that he was critical of, but not anti-Israel.
Oh,
I don't know enough about him. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I wouldn't call Amos Oz anti-Israel in any, he's a Zionist. He's a critical, very critical Zionist. He's a left-winger, but, he's not anti-Israel. But the others that you mentioned definitely are. I'm going to try and answer like that. It's an episode that is not so widely known. We're talking a lot about slavery lately, and I want to tell you an episode about slavery that is not, as I said, widely known. In United States, in the slavery South, being a slave was actually not just a matter of skin color, it was a matter of legal status. And so if you were a liberated Negro, as they called them then, you basically were a free person, even though you were black. And so some of these liberated blacks were themselves slave masters. Few of them, not many of them, but there were some. You could be some, and there were some in the South. Now, to me, that the fact that some black people themselves were masters of black slaves doesn't make slavery any more legitimate. It remains a horrible, horrible thing. And I'm making this comparison. So, the fact that some Jews or some Israelis, take these positions, these horrible positions, doesn't make those positions more acceptable or more legitimate. And also, I think we need to I don't want to question anyone's Judaism, but when we talk about being an Israeli, the fact that you own an Israeli passport or you're born in Israel the question is what you consider your identity to be. You know, if you don't consider yourself Israeli and you care nothing about being Israeli, are you really an Israeli just because you have the passport? I don't know. We can't hear you, Judy.
Old Judah wants to know why are the Scandinavians similar to the Europeans when it comes to Israel? They're not European, really.
They're not European. Well, I don't know that they're not European. I mean, Denmark and Sweden and okay, Finland isn't Scandinavian, but it's Nordic. That, you know, they're members of the European Union. Only Norway is not a member of the European Union. So I don't. Why? I think, you know, if you look at the parties that are in power in these countries, I think you can see the reason, and it's very much what we would have seen here if Jeremy Corbyn was in power as was prime minister, as leader of the Labour Party. You know, we're talking about socialist parties, but I don't have anything against socialist parties as such. But it depends where these parties position themselves, if they position themselves or they include very much the hard left or not.
Okay, so a few comments. Nationalism is not racism, from Noreen Firestone. Sulia Rose, it is always harder to walk the middle way. And Sarah, Israel is such a tempting scapegoat for ideologue.
Yes, so first of all, yeah, I think I said that nationalism as such is not racism. It can be racism if taken to extreme, of course. You know, extreme nationalism certainly, you know, leads to supremacism and all those bad things. But then extreme anything is bad. You know, food is, I think, for most of us, you know, I've taken a few pounds. Food is something we enjoy and it's very good and it adds a lot of pleasure to life. But if we do it too much, if we take it to extreme, then it becomes a very bad thing, a very dangerous thing.
Okay, a few other comments. This sounds similar but not identical to Gandhi's maxim about being the change you want to see in the world. That's William Ryan. And Sol Jude, another comment, the backlash is slow burning. I think once they battle for NEC control.
Sorry, who's battling for NEC control?
I'm not actually sure what he...
Okay, well.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned in the context of Starmer was doing the right thing, seems he has, seems the slow burning, it'll be a slow burning impact because there will be a battle for the NEC in terms of control, and there will be more hard left people trying to get control of the NEC. And so his current short-term success may not be a medium or long-term success. It might backfire on him. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, this, you know, something that again it's less known from history, but there was a period of time when the communists in Germany in the 1930s allied themselves for a while with the fascists against the Social Democrats. Okay, so there's a lot of enmity between these factions in the Labour Party. It's almost like a religious attitude, you know. And at some times in history, if you you know, I don't know, if you were a Catholic, perhaps you hated the Protestants even more than you hated the Jews, because they're not just a different religion. You know, they're heretics. that people who are part of your religion but take the wrong, take it to the wrong, and so there's a lot of problems there. And of course, I mean, one of the reasons Neil Kinnock got rid of the militant tendency is not because he personally didn't like them so much, but they were a threat to the party and to his leadership. He recognized that. And yes, if he leaves them in, then these people will continue to be a threat to Starmer's position, and they will attack him if he's seen as weakened or making mistakes. They will immediately attack him and try to take over, without doubt.
Richard Galba comments that there have been comments on blogs saying Starmer is controlled by his wife, who has Jewish connections when it comes to Israel.
Well, I don't personally know his wife. His comment was, first of all, nobody knew that his wife was Jewish, and funnily enough, he didn't actually say she was Jewish. To quote him exactly, he said that his wife's family is Jewish. Okay, that's what he said. You know, but obviously there will be anti-Semites out there that will see his wife as part of this ultra-powerful Jewish conspiracy that, you know, controls Starmer, controls Trump, controls everybody.
Seems to be a bit of a theme about people's wives, but anyway.
Oh, those wives.
I don't have a wife, so I don't know what it is. Barbara Levy says JLM was happy to nominate Lisa Nandy for the leadership after her strong performance. Maybe she's asking, was that the right thing to do?
The fact that Starmer has appointed Nandy.
No, that JLM was happy to nominate Jewish leadership. The Jewish Labour Movement was happy to nominate Lisa Nandy.
I think, first of all, I have to declare an interest. I didn't like the fact that they nominated Nandy. It was almost, to me, it was almost like, you know, we want to prove ourselves. We want to prove ourselves that we're Jews, but we don't, you know, we don't work for Israel. We're not paid by the Israeli embassy. We're not directed from Jerusalem or from Tel Aviv. You know, we want to prove our loyalty. And to prove our loyalty, we're going to nominate someone who's chair of the Labour Friends of Palestine. I don't think that was the smartest move. But you know, something else, as I hinted, something else has happened to the Jewish labor movement. As I said, it's moved to the left because a lot of the people who were more moderate in the Labour Party have left the Labour Party altogether. And so they left the Jewish labor movement as well. And so inevitably it's lurched to the left. But I don't think it was a very smart position, and I think they live to regret it. It's like the J Street in the United States. They nominated Ilhan Omar, and they had to take it back to reverse that nomination when she said something anti-Semitic. It's a mistake to do that. It's a mistake. Those of you who are British, I'm not British, so I can't say that, but those of you who are British, I'm sure you are very loyal British citizens, and you don't have to prove that to anyone. You know, nobody needs to prove their loyalty. We're not under a loyalty test. And so I think it was a mistake.
Interesting. I think that you can be a member of the Jewish Labour Movement without being a member of the Labour Party. So whether actually all the people left the Labour Party have left the Jewish Labour Movement is perhaps a a different question. I certainly know some who
that's
haven't.
also true. That's also true, yes. But I think if you are a member of the Jewish labor movement, but not a member of the party, I think inevitably, you know, your influence in the big scheme of things is a little bit smaller. But you're right, because it's an affiliated movement, so you don't have to be a member of the party. Yes.
Noreen Firestone says that Starmer stated he supports Zionism and believes in the state of Israel, and in that sense, I am a Zionist.
I think what he actually said, I think he denied that he expressly denied being a Zionist when he was directly asked. And by the way, he was asked at the hustings of the Jewish labor movement. He was asked, do you consider yourself a Zionist? And he said clearly, no, I'm not a Zionist. I wouldn't say I'm a Zionist. These were his words. But then he said something that he supports a secure Israel and so on. So that's why I concluded that he's not, you know, he's not, he doesn't have an empathy towards Jews and Israel in the way Tony Blair had, or in the way Theresa May had, to name another person, okay? He doesn't have that kind of empathy. He's much colder. He's not necessarily anti-Jews and Israel in the same way, but you know, he doesn't seem to put his feelings into that direction one way or another. It's more a cerebral assessment for him.
One question is, do you know whether the black slave owners treated their slaves as badly as the white slave owners?
The short answer is I don't know. But it wouldn't surprise me because, you know, first of all, if you know, if you're black and you keep other people, black people as slaves, you can't be a very, you know, sensitive and nice person. I wouldn't think so. It wouldn't surprise me if that was look. People do horrible things to each other. Even people that you know, should know better and should feel solidarity in principle. A lot of these slaves were delivered to the slave traders by black chieftains and black kings and you know, black warlords who are taking people captive and delivering them to the white slave traders. You know, and as we know, there were Jews who delivered Jews to the Nazis and so on. So, you know, people have this capacity to, just as we are complex and sophisticated in the way we can do good things, we unfortunately are sometimes sophisticated in the way we can do horrible things. I can't hear you, Judy. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I was using a system that worked before, but it stopped working. Maybe we're also trying to transpose back our ideas of black solidarity or white solidarity, which wasn't a concept then, and different Africans from different tribes or even different family groups wouldn't have felt any loyalty to other groups. But moving to a different subject, Alex Hearn says the difference with Kinnock and Militant was that Kinnock was driven in his task and there were only a handful of them, but there are thousands in this case.
Sorry, you broke a little bit, so I couldn't.
He said only a handful of militant tendency, whereas there are thousands in this case.
Right. I don't think there are thousands. I think that we heard that, you know, there was a list of 100,000 that were somehow mobilized. So yes, it's true. It's very true. But you know, the thing is, that at the end of the day, however many, and you know, I heard Corbyn many times priding himself in how many members the Labour is the biggest political party in Europe, and so on and so forth. But even if you have 500,000 members, you don't win elections with that. You know, you can gather together a few, you know, 100,000 extremists, but they don't deliver the prime ministership. They don't deliver the elections to you, and so ultimately, I think he will have to make a decision as to what is likely to make him a, you know, to get him the elections, to win him the elections. Because there's no point in being in politics for someone like Starmer. For someone like Corbyn, there is a point. He always thought the point is not to succeed. The point is to be pure. But Starmer definitely wants to succeed. And so, you know, I don't know. Unfortunately, as I indicated at the beginning, there are people who look at politics as a kind of tribal affair, okay? They don't say, I vote Labour, or even I support Labour. They say, I am Labour, you know, or I am a conservative. It kind of becomes part of their tribal identity. And that, I think, is wrong. Because, as I said, that, you know, if all of us were thinking in this way, we wouldn't have democracy. We would have one party in power all the time. We have to be able to, you know, change our opinions, to be mobile in our opinions, just as we are mobile and flexible with everything else.
Okay, so the question about the Democrats in the US who are becoming very anti-Israel and anti-Semitic even, and can we expect the same here from the Labour Party here? Maybe Lisa Nandy was the least worst.
I don't think that's true, actually. I think, you know, there's a current of opinion that that's where things might be going at some point. But I don't think that's true at all. I think they, you know, the problem with the media sometimes is you hear about the outliers. You don't hear about the, you know, the normal. It's the man bites dog effect, okay? And so when you hear about things about the Democratic Party in the United States, you hear, you know, Ilhan Omar or all kinds of outliers. But actually, the majority of the Democratic Party is still very strongly pro-Israel. I mean, look at who they nominated as candidate for presidency. Joe Biden is certainly pro-Israel. You know, he might not be pro-Israel in the way Trump is pro-Israel, but he is pro-Israel. You know, he's someone who cares about Israel, even, I would say, in the way, almost in the way that Tony Blair did.
Okay, thank you. So will Keir Starmer support sanctions against Israel if annexation goes ahead?
I certainly think that he will support sanctions in the opposition. Whether he would implement sanction if he were in government, that's a different story. You know, it costs nothing for him in the opposition to call for sanctions. He'll probably won't call for sanctions against Israel. He'll call for boycott of settlement goods, which is a sanction, because let's make it very clear that you know, I'd like to make something very clear. You can't separate the production in the settlements from the production in Israel. Maybe if we're talking agricultural produce, you can, you know, whether the tomato grew in one place or grew in another. But if you talk about anything else, you know, so one of my customers, when I was working in Israel, I worked in the plastics industry. One of my customers was Keter Plastics, okay? Keter Plastics is a global producer. They have factories all over the world, but they have many factories in Israel. It's an Israeli company originally. And they have one factory in the Barkan industrial zone, which is in the West Bank, okay? That factory, 95% of the workers are Palestinians. Very few are Israeli Jews. But nevertheless, it's in the West Bank. But that factory makes things that are then assembled in different factories. So, you know, they might make a screw in that factory that then gets, you know, put into a warehouse. So am I going to, you know, how do you do this? Are we going to boycott the entire warehouse because of that screw, which is produced in a settlement? It's impossible to actually make that. And those who advocate this kind of boycotts are aware of that. In fact, it's a backdoor, and they say that, you know, people like Palestine Solidarity Campaign, they say that. It's a backdoor to a total boycott of Israel. You start with the settlements, then you boycott the Israeli products that include a component made in the settlements, and so on and so forth. And then you boycott the banks that give loans to the companies in the settlements, you boycott the telecommunication company that gives services to that, and so on and so. You know, it's a snowball.
Thank you. So Jack Green is asking, the leaders at the EU in Brussels believe that the formation of one massive country, the EU, has brought peace to Europe, but the population of different countries of the EU, by and large, do not like being members because of their long-established ancient cultures are suppressed. We Jews want to maintain our own cultural differences and to have our own country to exercise these cultural differences. So how is the Palestinian movement and its ambitions different to that of the Jews?
Well, it certainly isn't. In fact, they often they mold their nationalistic activity deliberately on that of the Jews in the pre-state Israel. Deliberately they do that. And actually, if you read the Palestinian Declaration of Independence, some of the expressions, some of the, they basically almost copied them from Israel's Declaration of Independence. So no, I don't think it's different. Now, you know, I'm very, if I were more diplomatic, I try to keep away from the debate on Brexit and all that, because quite frankly, I'm not British. And although I live here and work here and pay taxes here, I don't vote. I didn't vote in the referendum because I'm not a British citizen, and so I should keep away from it. I think, let me put it this way: a European bloc is an economic bloc, and a political alliance. These are, I think, good ideas because, you know, they give Europe more of a say, more power globally. But I think the thing, and I think as Jack hinted, the thing that people don't like is that bit that says an ever closer union. That then becomes a problem, because if you say ever closer union, that means that the ultimate goal is one state, okay, where, as you heard, you know, people must feel Europeans and not Germans or French or Danish and so on. And I don't think most Europeans want this. Even I think those who are in favor of the European Union, they don't really want to lose their national identity. I think identity is precious to people.
Okay, so Sol Judah says, I understand that the PA is now prepared to come to the table. Will this mean that annexation will be on hold?
Well, so, you know, first of all, we see, and I refer to the webinar that I did on annexation, and I said somewhere there that, and I know this as a manager, that sometimes if you want to effect a change, a radical change, you've got to have a crisis, because if you don't have a crisis, people don't like to change. And so the threat of annexation has created a crisis, and the Palestinians react to this crisis. I mean, that's why they didn't want to negotiate before. I mean, only a month ago, they didn't want to negotiate directly with Israel. And in fact, you know, I read in the newspaper, they say there were no negotiations direct negotiations since 2014. That is wrong, because the negotiations in 2014 were not direct negotiations. They refused to negotiate in 2014 directly. It was all via Kerry, via John Kerry. It wasn't direct at all. So for years they haven't, so now they say they want to negotiate directly. Of course, Israel will be very suspicious of this, because the suspicion is that they say they want to negotiate. They'll start to, as usual in these things, they'll start to negotiate on how to negotiate, first of all, okay? Because that's the way it's done in the Middle East. And by the time they'll even have to meet with Israelis, it'll be November already, and maybe Trump will be out, and maybe the whole thing with annexation will be theoretical, you know, it'll be a moot point. So Israel, I think, will be very suspicious of this sudden desire to negotiate directly. But I think politically speaking, diplomatically speaking, Israel will have to react somehow. And they might react by saying, yes, fantastic, we will negotiate as long as you agree to negotiate based on Trump's plan. You know, you don't need to accept everything that's in the Trump's plan, but you know, you need to accept it as a basis for negotiation, which something that the Palestinians, the Palestinian leadership, I should say, won't do, I think, or can't do at the current time. But make no mistakes, the Palestinian leadership is under tremendous, and I'm talking about the PLO, not about Hamas. Hamas too, but the PLO is under tremendous pressure. I think their approval rates within the population is in the low 2 figures, okay? They're very unpopular. To the extent that they really struggled to get people out to demonstrations against Israel. Usually it's no problem to stage a demonstration, a Palestinian demonstration against Israel, you know, and thousands of people will come. Now they really struggle. Most of these demonstrations have been pitiful in their numbers, really 100 people, 200 people, and those people were generally civil servants that were told to get out of the offices and demonstrate. So they really struggle to mobilize the Palestinian street.
I think this is a good point at which we should start to wrap up, Noru. The comments I'm getting now are all thank yous. Everybody is very much appreciating the talk you've given, saying that you've given lots of food for thought, an excellent talk, and lots of original ideas. So on behalf of everybody, I think I speak for everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.
Anybody who wants to unmute is welcome to do so.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Mervyn, are you wanting to say something? If so, you should unmute, please. You need to unmute. Mervyn, please unmute yourself.
Ah, fabulous, Judy. Really interesting.
That was good, very interesting.
Sorry,
From one Israeli to another.
Excellent.
It was very interesting.
I left a note because I wanted to ask a question, but could you ask Noru that I was very surprised that he didn't mention John Landsman and Momentum, who are the ringleaders of the Labour Party, and I'd appreciate his thoughts on that. And also what his thoughts are. In my opinion, we have a cult situation as far as Palestinian Arabs are concerned. And does he agree with that? Or is he finding that the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs, are becoming a bit more independent?
Bit more
what? Can I leave that with you?
Noru, if you're there, would you like to comment on that? I have a feeling we've lost Noru, so it may be a good time to... Noru, are you there? Okay, well, I think we've said our thank yous and we'll say good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, Judy.
It was very good. Excellent.
Thank you.